The first light of dawn crept through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine slowly opened her eyes. Today was not like any other day. Today, her father-in-law would become king and her family would play a huge part in making history. She sat up in bed and looked at the beautiful dress hanging on the door. The ivory silk gown seemed to glow in the morning light. Her heart beat a little faster as she thought about the millions of people who would be watching them today. Room next door, William was already awake. He had been thinking about this day for months. As the future king, he knew how important today would be for his family and for the whole country. He walked to the window and looked out at the gardens. Even this early in the morning he could see people walking toward Westminster Abbey. Some had been camping on the streets all night just to get a good spot to see the royal family. Down the hall, 10-year-old Prince George was sitting on his bed holding a piece of paper. Written on it were all the things he needed to remember for today. As a page boy, he would help carry his grandfather's heavy robes during the ceremony. His teacher had practiced with him many times, but George still felt nervous. What if he dropped something or walked in the wrong direction? All the important people in the world would be watching him. Princess Charlotte was 8 years old and she was excited rather than nervous. She loved big events and pretty dresses. Her nanny was already helping her get ready. Charlotte looked at herself in the mirror and smiled. She felt like a real princess today. She had been practicing her curtsy and how to sit properly during the long ceremony. Unlike her brothers, she was not worried about making mistakes. She just wanted to wave at all the people who would be watching. 5-year-old Prince Louis was the youngest and he did not fully understand what was happening today. He knew it was something very important because everyone had been talking about it for weeks. His parents had explained that Grandpa Charles would get a special crown today and that the whole family needed to be on their best behavior. Louis had promised to sit still, but sitting still for a long time was very hard for a 5-year-old boy. Catherine got out of bed and walked to her dressing room, where her team of helpers was waiting. Her hairstylist, makeup artist, and dresser had all arrived very early to make sure everything would be perfect. They had been planning this look for months. Every detail had been thought about carefully. The headpiece she would wear was made by the same designer who had made her wedding dress 12 years ago. It was covered in tiny diamonds and silver leaves that would catch the light beautifully. The makeup artist began working on Catherine's face, using colors that would look natural but still show up well in photographs. Catherine had learned over the years that royal makeup needed to be perfect for hours and hours. She could not touch up her lipstick during the ceremony, so everything had to be done perfectly from the start. As she sat in the chair having her makeup done, she thought about all the other royal women who had prepared for similar moments throughout history. William was in his dressing room putting on his military uniform. The red and gold jacket was covered in medals and honors that told the story of his service to the country. Each button had been polished until it shined like a mirror. His military boots were so shiny he could see his reflection in them. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he thought about how proud his mother, Princess Diana, would have been to see this day. She had always taught him that being royal meant serving other people. Back in the children's rooms, the 3 young royals were getting help from their nannies. George's pageboy outfit was a smaller version of what the adult courtiers would wear. The white and gold uniform made him look very grown up. He practiced walking slowly and keeping his back straight just like he had been taught. His nanny reminded him to smile and not to worry if something went wrong because everyone would understand. Charlotte's dress was a beautiful cream color with delicate embroidery around the sleeves and neckline. Her shoes were specially made to be comfortable because she would be standing and walking for hours. Her hair was styled in a neat bun with a small tiara that had belonged to her great-grandmother. She felt very special wearing something with so much history. Louis was wearing a smaller version of his father's military-style outfit. His nanny had to help him with all the buttons and make sure his collar was straight. Louis kept trying to touch his hair, but his nanny gently moved his hands away. She knew that keeping a 5-year-old looking perfect for an entire day would be one of the biggest challenges of the coronation. Catherine's hair was being styled into an elegant up that would support her headpiece properly. The hairstylist worked carefully to make sure every strand was in the right place. This hairstyle needed to last for the entire day without any pieces falling down. Hidden bobby pins held everything in place while still making it look natural and effortless. As the morning continued, the palace filled with the quiet energy of preparation. Footmen polished the carriages that would take the family to Westminster Abbey. Security teams checked and double-checked every detail of the route they would travel. Kitchen staff prepared a light breakfast that the family could eat without worrying about spilling anything on their special clothes. The media outside the palace gates was growing larger by the hour. Reporters from around the world had come to London to cover this historic day. Television crews were setting up their cameras to catch every moment of the royal family leaving the palace. The excitement was building not just inside the palace, but all across London and around the world. Catherine took a few moments to herself before the final preparations began. She walked to the nursery where her youngest children had played when they were babies. Today, those babies would be part of one of the most important ceremonies in British history. She thought about how much their lives had changed and how much more they would change in the years to come. William joined his wife, and together they went to check on their children one final time. Before leaving for Westminster Abbey, George looked handsome and serious in his pageboy uniform. Charlotte was practically glowing with excitement in her beautiful dress. Louis was fidgeting a little, but looked adorable in his miniature military outfit. The family was ready to make history together. The morning sun was getting brighter, and the crowds outside were getting larger. Soon it would be time to leave the safety and privacy of Kensington Palace and step into the public eye. Today, the whole world would be watching as this family took their place in a ceremony that connected them to hundreds of years of British royal tradition. The preparation was almost complete, and the historic day was about to begin. The golden carriage stood waiting outside Kensington Palace like something from a fairy tale. Its polished surface reflected the morning sunlight and the crowds of people who had gathered to catch their first glimpse of the royal family. Catherine stepped out of the palace doors, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Her ivory dress flowed behind her like liquid silk, and her diamond headpiece caught the light with every step. She moved with the grace that had made her beloved around the world, but inside her heart was beating fast with excitement and nerves. William appeared beside his wife, looking every inch the future king in his ceremonial military uniform. The red jacket with its gold braiding and shining medals told the story of his dedication to serving his country. He offered Catherine his arm, and together they walked toward the waiting carriage. Behind them, their 3 children followed with their nannies close by. George walked with careful steps, trying to remember everything he had been taught about posture and protocol. Charlotte practically skipped with joy, unable to contain her excitement about riding in the special carriage. Little Louis held his nanny's hand tightly as he stared up at the enormous golden carriage. He had seen pictures of it in books, but seeing it in real life was completely different. The carriage was covered in beautiful carvings and decorations that seemed to tell stories of kings and queens from long ago. The horses that would pull them were magnificent white animals with braided manes and special ceremonial harnesses that sparkled with gold and silver. As the family climbed into the carriage, Catherine helped arrange the children's clothes to make sure everything looked perfect. She smoothed down Charlotte's dress and adjusted Louis's collar, while William made sure George's pageboy uniform was sitting properly. The inside of the carriage was lined with soft velvet and had windows on all sides, so people could see the royal family clearly as they passed by. The carriage began to move, and immediately, the crowds along the street began cheering and waving British flags. Catherine waved back with the gentle motion she had perfected over years of royal duties. Her smile was warm and genuine as she looked at all the people who had come out to celebrate this historic day. Some people had been waiting since the night before sleeping on the streets just to see this moment. George sat up very straight and waved carefully, just like his parents had taught him. He was amazed by how many people were lining the streets. Everywhere he looked, there were faces smiling and hands waving. Some people were holding up signs with messages of support for his grandfather, who would soon become king. George felt proud to be part of something so important and special. Charlotte was having the time of her life. She waved enthusiastically at everyone they passed, and her face was bright with joy. She pointed excitedly when she saw children in the crowd who were about her age. Some were wearing crowns made of paper or holding toy flags. Charlotte felt like she was in the middle of the most wonderful parade in the world. She had never seen so many happy people all in one place. Louis was fascinated by everything he saw through the carriage windows. The crowds of people seemed to go on forever. He could hear them cheering and singing even through the thick glass of the carriage. Sometimes he would wave, but mostly he just stared in wonder at the sea of faces and flags that surrounded them. His little hand found his mother's, and Catherine gave it a reassuring squeeze. The streets of London had been transformed for this special day. Union Jack flags hung from every building, and lampposts were decorated with golden ribbons. Shop windows displayed pictures of the royal family and messages of congratulations for the new king. The route from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey had been planned months in advance, to give as many people as possible the chance to see the royal procession. William looked out at the crowds and felt overwhelmed by the love and support shown by the British people. These were people from all walks of life who had come together to celebrate something bigger than themselves. He saw elderly people in wheelchairs who had been brought out by their families. He saw young children on their parents' shoulders getting their first taste of royal pageantry. He saw teenagers taking selfies and videos to share with friends around the world. As they traveled through different neighborhoods, the character of the crowds changed, but the enthusiasm remained the same. In some areas, people had organized street parties with tables full of food and decorations in red, white, and blue. In other places, school children had been brought out in their uniforms, holding handmade signs and singing songs they had learned specially for the coronation. Catherine noticed how the children in the crowds reacted. When they saw George, Charlotte, and Louis in the carriage, young faces would light up with excitement, and parents would lift their children higher so they could get a better view. She realized that for many of these children, this would be a memory they would carry for the rest of their lives. They would be able to tell their own children and grandchildren about the day they saw the royal family on Coronation Day. The carriage passed by Hyde Park, where thousands more people had gathered to watch the procession on giant television screens. The park looked like a massive outdoor festival with people sitting on blankets and chairs enjoying the spring weather. Food vendors were selling coronation-themed treats and souvenir sellers were doing excellent business with their royal memorabilia. Police officers lined the entire route, keeping everyone safe while still allowing people to feel close to the historic moment. The officers smiled and waved along with the crowds, showing that they too were caught up in the excitement of the day. Mounted police on beautiful horses rode alongside the carriage, adding to the ceremonial atmosphere. As they got closer to Westminster Abbey, the crowds became even thicker and the cheering grew louder. People were hanging out of windows in the buildings above the street trying to get photographs of the royal family. The noise was incredible, but it was a joyful noise full of celebration and pride. George began to feel more nervous as Westminster Abbey came into view. Soon he would have to get out of the safety of the carriage and perform his duties as a page boy in front of all the most important people in the world. His father seemed to sense his nervousness and leaned over to whisper some encouraging words in his ear. William reminded George that he had practiced many times and that everyone was proud of him no matter what happened. Charlotte was bouncing slightly in her seat with excitement as she saw the ancient abbey ahead of them. She had visited Westminster Abbey before on school trips, but today it looked completely different. It was decorated with flowers and flags, and there were red carpets leading to the entrance. Television cameras were positioned everywhere, ready to capture every moment of their arrival. The carriage began to slow down as they approached their destination. Catherine took a deep breath and looked at her family. In just a few minutes they would step out of this carriage and into history. Today would change their lives forever, and she wanted to remember every detail of this journey through London. The crowds, the flags, the joy on people's faces, and the feeling of being part of something truly magnificent. The journey was almost over, but the real adventure was about to begin. The golden carriage came to a gentle stop outside Westminster Abbey, and suddenly everything felt different. The cheerful noise of the crowds seemed to fade into a respectful hush as the ancient stones of the abbey came into full view. Catherine looked up at the towering Gothic spires that had witnessed the coronations of kings and queens for nearly 1,000 years. Today, her father-in-law would join that long line of monarchs and her family would be part of making history. Footmen in their finest uniforms stepped forward to open the carriage door. Catherine gathered her silk skirts carefully as William stepped out first, then turned to help her down. The moment her feet touched the red carpet that led to the abbey entrance, cameras flashed from every direction. Photographers from around the world had positioned themselves to capture this historic arrival. Catherine smiled gracefully and waved to the crowds who had gathered in the areas where they could still see the royal family. George took a deep breath as he climbed out of the carriage. His pageboy uniform felt heavier now that he was about to perform his real duties. He had practiced so many times, but now, with hundreds of important guests waiting inside the abbey, everything felt more serious. His grandfather, the soon-to-be king, was already inside preparing for the most important moment of his life. George knew that, in just a few minutes, he would be helping to carry the heavy ceremonial robes that were part of the ancient coronation ritual. Charlotte stepped onto the red carpet with a bright smile on her face. She looked around at all the decorations and flowers that had transformed the entrance to Westminster Abbey. White and gold flowers were arranged in beautiful displays, and red carpet runners led in different directions for the various members of the royal family and important guests. Charlotte had never seen Westminster Abbey looking so grand and special. She felt like she was walking into a fairy tale. Little Louis held tightly to his nanny's hand as they walked toward the abbey entrance. The building looked enormous to a 5-year-old boy, and he could hear the sound of organ music coming from inside. The music was deep and powerful and seemed to make the very air around them vibrate. Louis had heard this music during their practice sessions, but hearing it in the actual abbey was completely different. It made him feel small, but also part of something very big and important. As they walked along the red carpet, Catherine could see familiar faces among the guests who were entering the abbey. There were members of royal families from other countries who had traveled from around the world to witness this coronation. There were politicians and religious leaders and representatives from every part of British society. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, and many were wearing medals and honors that caught the light as they moved. The entrance to Westminster Abbey had been decorated with thousands of flowers in white and gold. The arrangements were so beautiful they looked like works of art. Catherine recognized some of the flowers as being from the gardens of the royal palaces. It was a tradition to use flowers that had special meaning for the royal family. The sweet scent of the flowers mixed with the ancient smell of the old stone building created an atmosphere that was both grand and welcoming. William walked beside his wife with military precision, but his eyes were constantly checking on his children. He could see that George was nervous, but holding himself well. Charlotte looked confident and happy to be there. Louis seemed a bit overwhelmed by everything, but was staying close to his nanny and following instructions. William felt proud of how well his children were handling this enormous occasion. As they reached the entrance to the abbey, Catherine could hear the magnificent organ music more clearly. The organist was playing pieces that had been chosen specially for the coronation. Some were traditional pieces that had been played at coronations for hundreds of years. Others were newer compositions that had been written especially for this historic day. The music seemed to lift everyone's spirits and prepare them for the sacred ceremony that was about to begin. Inside the abbey, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. 2,000 guests were seated in carefully arranged sections. The front rows were reserved for members of the royal family and heads of state from around the world. Behind them sat members of parliament, government officials, and representatives from the church and military. Every seat in the ancient building was filled with someone who had been chosen to witness this moment in history. George was taken to a special area, where the other pages in ceremonial attendance were waiting. These were young men from noble families who had been chosen to help with the coronation ceremony. They had all been practicing together for months, and George knew most of them from their rehearsals. Seeing the familiar faces of the other pages helped calm his nerves. They were all in this together, and they had all prepared carefully for their important roles. Charlotte and Louis were guided to their seats in the front section, where they would have a perfect view of the entire ceremony. Their seats were specially chosen so they could see everything that would happen during the coronation. Charlotte sat up straight and looked around at all the magnificent decorations inside the abbey. The ancient columns were draped with golden cloth, and beautiful tapestries hung from the walls. Everywhere she looked there were flowers and candles, and symbols of the monarchy. The abbey itself seemed to glow with golden light from hundreds of candles and special lighting that had been installed for the ceremony. The stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the stone walls and floor. The famous coronation chair sat in the center of the abbey, looking both ancient and magnificent. This was the chair where English monarchs had been crowned for over 700 years. Soon, Catherine's father-in-law would sit in this chair and receive the crown that would make him king. Catherine took her place in the royal section and looked around at the incredible scene. The abbey was filled with people from every part of the world who had come to witness this historic moment. She could see the Archbishop of Canterbury, who would perform the coronation ceremony. He was wearing his finest robes and looked dignified and ready for the sacred duties he was about to perform. The sound of trumpets filled the abbey, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Catherine felt her heart beat faster as she realized that in just a few moments her father-in-law would enter the abbey and the coronation would officially start. She looked over at her children and saw that they were all sitting properly and paying attention. George was in position with the other pages, ready to perform his duties. Charlotte and Louis were watching everything with wide eyes full of wonder and excitement. The music grew louder and more magnificent as the moment approached. The organ was joined by a full choir, whose voices soared up to the ancient stone ceiling of the abbey. The combination of voices and instruments created a sound that was both powerful and deeply moving. Catherine felt tears of emotion beginning to form in her eyes as she realized she was about to witness something that would be remembered for centuries to come. The great doors of Westminster Abbey began to open, and the official coronation procession was about to begin. Catherine straightened her shoulders and prepared to watch her father-in-law become king. Her family was ready to play their part in this ancient ceremony that would change their lives forever. The moment they had all been preparing for was finally here. The great doors of Westminster Abbey swung open, and King Charles entered in his magnificent robes. The entire abbey fell silent as 2,000 guests rose to their feet. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat as she watched her father-in-law walk slowly down the ancient aisle. He looked every inch a king even before the crown was placed on his head. His purple and gold robes trailed behind him, carried carefully by young pages, including her own son George. The sight of her 10-year-old boy helping to carry the robes of the future king filled Catherine with pride and emotion. George concentrated hard on his steps as he helped carry the heavy ceremonial robes. The fabric was made of the finest silk and velvet and was decorated with golden thread and precious jewels. It had taken months to create these special robes just for the coronation. George could feel the weight of history in his hands as he walked behind his grandfather. Every step had to be perfect because millions of people around the world were watching this moment. His training had prepared him well, but nothing could have prepared him for the feeling of actually being part of such an important ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood waiting at the altar dressed in his finest white and gold robes. He had spent months preparing for this day, studying the ancient words and rituals that would make Charles the official king. The coronation ceremony had been performed in almost exactly the same way for over 1,000 years. Today he would speak the same words that had been spoken to kings and queens throughout British history. The responsibility he felt was enormous, but he was ready to perform his sacred duty. Charlotte watched in wonder as her grandfather walked toward the altar. Had seen him many times at family gatherings, but today he looked completely different. The ceremonial robes and the serious atmosphere of the abbey made him seem more like the kings she had read about in history books. She sat perfectly still, just like her parents had taught her. Even though she was only 8 years old, she understood that she was watching something that would be remembered forever. The choir began to sing an ancient hymn that had been sung at coronations for hundreds of years. Their voices filled every corner of the abbey and seemed to make the very stones sing along. Catherine felt goosebumps on her arms as the beautiful music surrounded her. She looked over at William and saw that he too was deeply moved by the ceremony. This was the moment when his father would officially become king, and William would move one step closer to his own future as monarch. Queen Camilla walked behind her husband wearing a beautiful white dress and looking serene and dignified. She would also be crowned today, becoming the first queen consort in over 70 years. Catherine watched her with admiration, knowing how much courage it took to marry into the royal family and take on such enormous responsibilities. Camilla had spent years learning how to be royal, and today she would officially take her place beside the king. Little Louis sat between his parents, trying his best to stay quiet and still. The ceremony was very long and formal, which was difficult for a 5-year-old boy, but the music and the beautiful decorations kept him interested. He could see his big brother George near the altar, helping with the important ceremony. Louis felt proud that his brother was playing such a special part in making their grandfather the king. Sometimes he whispered quiet questions to his mother, who answered him in soft whispers. The archbishop began the ancient coronation service with words that had been spoken in this very place for centuries. He asked the congregation if they would accept Charles as their king, and voices throughout the abbey responded with a thunderous yes. The sound echoed off the stone walls and made everyone feel they were part of something much bigger than themselves. Catherine felt tears in her eyes as she realized she was witnessing the exact moment when Charles officially became king. George carefully helped position the ceremonial robes as his grandfather prepared for the most sacred part of the ceremony. The St. Edward's crown sat on a special cushion nearby. This crown was made of solid gold and was covered with precious stones that had been collected over hundreds of years. It was incredibly heavy and only used for coronations. George had seen pictures of it many times, but seeing it in person was breathtaking. The jewels caught the light from the candles and seemed to glow with their own inner fire. The most solemn moment of the entire ceremony arrived when King Charles sat in the ancient coronation chair. This chair had been used for the coronation of almost every English monarch since the year 1300. It was made of oak wood and was decorated with gold leaf that had worn away in some places, showing the incredible age of this sacred piece of furniture. Catherine watched as her father-in-law prepared to receive the crown that would make him the official head of the British monarchy. The archbishop lifted the heavy St. Edward's crown with both hands. The entire abbey fell completely silent as he prepared to place it on the king's head. This was the moment that everyone had been waiting for. Catherine held her breath as she watched the crown slowly descend toward her father-in-law's head. When it finally settled into place, the transformation was complete. Charles was now officially King Charles III. And the crowds inside and outside the abbey erupted in celebration. The moment the crown touched the king's head, trumpets began to play and church bells started ringing throughout London. The sound was magnificent and triumphant. Charlotte clapped her hands together with joy, and even serious George allowed himself a small smile. William reached over and took Catherine's hand as they watched his father officially become king. The weight of their own future responsibilities felt heavier in that moment, but also more real and meaningful. Queen Camilla was then crowned with a beautiful diamond crown that had belonged to previous queen consorts. She looked elegant and happy. As she took her place beside her husband, the sight of the newly crowned king and queen sitting together on their thrones was magnificent. They looked like they had stepped out of a fairy tale, but Catherine knew that their real work was just beginning. Being king and queen meant a lifetime of service to the country and its people. The ancient words of the coronation oath filled the abbey as King Charles promised to serve his people faithfully for the rest of his life. His voice was strong and clear as he made these sacred promises. Catherine felt moved by the sincerity in his voice and the weight of the commitment he was making. She knew that these same words would one day be spoken by William. When his time came to be king, the congregation sang the national anthem with more feeling and emotion than Catherine had ever heard before. Every voice in the abbey joined together in celebrating their new king. The music seemed to lift the roof off the ancient building and carry their joy up to the heavens. George had finished his duties perfectly and was now able to watch the rest of the ceremony from his special seat with the other pages. As the coronation ceremony continued with more prayers and blessings, Catherine looked around at her family. Her children had behaved beautifully and had played their parts in this historic day perfectly. William looked proud and ready for his own future responsibilities. The ceremony was nearing its end, but Catherine knew that this day would stay with all of them forever. They had witnessed the making of a king and had played their own important part in British royal history. The final prayers of the coronation ceremony echoed through Westminster Abbey as King Charles and Queen Camilla prepared to leave as the newly crowned monarchs. Catherine watched as her father-in-law stood up from the ancient coronation chair. Wearing the heavy St. Edward's crown, he looked transformed by the ceremony, not just by the magnificent robes and crown, but by the weight of responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. The man who had entered the Abbey as a prince was now leaving as the King of England and the Commonwealth realms. The great procession began to form as the royal family and important guests prepared to leave the Abbey. George had completed his duties as a page boy perfectly and was now walking with quiet pride beside the other young attendants. His job was done, but Catherine could see that the experience had changed him. He walked taller and with more confidence, knowing that he had played an important part in making his grandfather the king. The other pages smiled at him with respect for how well he had handled the pressure of such an important day. Charlotte and Louis were guided to their places in the leaving procession. Charlotte practically glowed with happiness as she walked. In her beautiful dress, she had loved every moment of the ceremony and felt like she had been part of the most wonderful celebration in the world. She waved at some of the guests as they passed, and several people smiled back at the charming young princess. Louis held his nanny's hand, but walked with more confidence than when they had arrived. The long ceremony had tired him, but he seemed proud to have been part of such an important day. As the royal family walked toward the Abbey doors, Catherine could hear the sounds of celebration from outside. The crowds who had been watching on giant screens throughout London were cheering and singing. Church bells were ringing across the city, and she could hear the distant sound of military bands playing triumphant music. The whole country was celebrating the coronation of their new king and the beginning of a new chapter in British history. William walked beside Catherine with his military medals, catching the light from the Abbey's magnificent windows. He looked every inch the future king, but Catherine knew he was also thinking about what this day meant for their family. His father was now king, which meant William was officially the heir to the throne, and their children were now even closer to their own future roles in the monarchy. The weight of these changes felt both exciting and overwhelming. The moment they stepped outside Westminster Abbey, the noise of celebration hit them like a wave. Thousands of people were cheering and waving flags. The military bands were playing stirring music, and the horse guards were lined up in perfect formation. The sight was breathtaking, and Catherine felt her heart swell with emotion at the incredible display of support for the royal family. The British people had turned out in amazing numbers to celebrate their new king. King Charles and Queen Camilla climbed into the magnificent gold state coach that would take them back to Buckingham Palace. This coach was even more spectacular than the one that had brought the family to the Abbey. It was covered in gold decorations and was pulled by 8 beautiful gray horses. The coach had been used for coronations and other great state occasions for over 200 years. Today, it would carry the newly crowned king and queen through the streets of London so their subjects could see them and celebrate. Catherine and William climbed into their own carriage with their 3 children. The family was tired from the emotional intensity of the ceremony, but also energized by the incredible atmosphere of celebration surrounding them. As their carriage began to move, Catherine looked out at the crowds lining the streets. If anything, there were even more people than there had been on the journey to the Abbey. Word had spread throughout London that the coronation was complete and people wanted to be part of the celebration. The journey back to Buckingham Palace felt like a victory parade. Every street was packed with people waving Union Jack flags and cheering at the top of their voices. Street parties were happening everywhere with tables full of food and people dancing in the streets. Children were wearing paper crowns and holding toy flags. Elderly people were sitting in chairs that had been brought out specially so they could see the royal procession. The whole city had become one giant celebration. George waved at the crowds with a new sense of confidence. He had successfully completed his role as a page boy and felt proud of his contribution to the historic day. People in the crowds seemed to recognize him and cheered extra loudly when they saw the young prince who had helped crown his grandfather. George felt a deeper understanding of what it meant to be royal and what his own future might hold. The ceremony had been like a preview of the responsibilities he would one day carry. Charlotte was in her element, waving enthusiastically at everyone they passed. She loved the attention and the celebration and felt like she was living in the most wonderful fairy tale. Some people in the crowds were holding up signs with her name on them, and she felt like a real celebrity. The joy and excitement of the day had filled her with happiness that seemed to bubble over into everything around her. She never wanted this magical day to end. Little Louis was getting sleepy after the long day, but he still managed to wave at the people who were celebrating outside. He did not fully understand everything that had happened, but he knew it was something very special and important. His grandfather was now the king, and that made Louis feel proud and excited about his own place in the royal family. He rested his head against his mother's shoulder as they rode through the celebrating crowds. As they approached Buckingham Palace, Catherine could see that the areas around the palace were completely packed with people. The mall was a sea of red white and blue flags, and the noise of celebration was incredible. This was where the newly crowned king and queen would appear on the famous balcony to wave at their subjects. It was a tradition that went back generations and would be the perfect ending to this historic day. The carriages arrived at Buckingham Palace and the royal family climbed out to the cheers of palace staff who had lined up to welcome them home. Catherine felt exhausted but also exhilarated by everything they had experienced. The day had been perfect in every way, and her family had played their parts beautifully. George had been outstanding as a page boy, Charlotte had been charming and well-behaved, and even little Louis had managed the long ceremony better than anyone had hoped. Inside the palace, there was a sense of celebration and relief that everything had gone so well. The coronation had been watched by millions of people around the world, and everyone agreed it had been magnificent. King Charles looked tired but happy as he prepared for the final official duty of the day, appearing on the palace balcony, with his family to acknowledge the crowds, who were still celebrating outside. Catherine helped the children get ready for their balcony appearance. This would be the moment when the whole family would appear together as the new generation of the royal family with King Charles at its head. She smoothed down the children's clothes and made sure they looked perfect for the final photographs of this historic day. In just a few minutes, they would step out onto the balcony and wave at the thousands of people who had come to celebrate their new king. The balcony doors opened, and the sound of cheering from the crowd below was deafening. King Charles and Queen Camilla stepped out first, followed by William and Catherine and their 3 children. The sight of the entire royal family together on the balcony sent the crowd into wild celebration. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the official presentation of the new royal family to the nation and the world. As Catherine stood on the balcony waving at the incredible crowd below, she reflected on everything that had happened. Today had changed their family forever. Her father-in-law was now king, her husband was officially the heir to the throne, and her children had taken their first real steps into their roles as future leaders of the royal family. The day had been perfect and had given them all memories that would last a lifetime. The future looked bright and full of possibilities as they began this new chapter in their royal story.